very comprehensive presentations. I've got a couple of questions of my own, and then I'll go to the screen. I mean, what you were reflecting on, all three of you, sort of was going into the more micro of what, a lot of what was said this morning on innovation, product specialization, etc. And of course, your three companies do specialize in some of those different products that were referred to today. I'd like to start with Mr. Stodel, please, and just ask you a little bit about the application of silicon to the PV market, because that's obviously very significant here in the Gulf. We've seen a lot of progression made on that front in a very natural market, you would say, for photovoltaic energy. And a few years ago, a lot of people were very skeptical about what advances that sector was doing here, but clearly a lot of progress has been done. So where do you see that going in terms of the potential for the GCC and in terms of a silicon supplier like you, and the growth for that market?
Well, the potential here, of course, is great. I mean, there's a lot of local energy needed to cool down buildings, for example. Yeah, you need to cool when the sun is shining, and so it's very apparent that it's right to produce the electricity through photovoltaics. And the costs have come down significantly, as I mentioned in my presentation. Growth opportunities for photovoltaic here in this region are certainly enormous. And if you imagine right now in the world, I also mentioned the number, around 70 gigawatts are installed annually. Most of it presently in China, but also in the United States, especially in the southern region of the United States, also for cooling purposes. And so I think the opportunities for the photovoltaic industry are or continue to be very, very good.
And I mean, more so, let's say, in this region than in others. I mean, in terms of you being one of those suppliers who plugs into that, would you say that the GCC would be a focus for a company like yours, or would it be Asia? Would it be further East Asia?
Well, we actually provide the silicon, the base material. We do not make the modules. The modules are to about 60-70% made in China. I'm very certain that many Chinese companies and other producers, American, and there is one German producer left, or a bigger German producer left, they certainly are represented very well in this area and are trying to sell their modules.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Zacher, I'd like to go to you about your point on joint ventures and how critical those are going forward. You referenced obviously your joint venture with Aramco recently in terms of finding sort of synergies along the value chain. And you also referenced in your presentation about the focus should be on Asia, because that's where the demand, most of the demand is going to come from. European companies are struggling in this space, and you were saying they need to reposition themselves in order to remain competitive and sort of be able to apply themselves to markets. How specifically should they do that? What repositioning are you talking about? I mean, in terms more specialized in their product range, focusing more on what the consumer would like. How are they going to do that tactically?
Well, the chemical industry offers plenty of spaces to further focus on specialized areas, differentiated products, specialty grades, and therefore you've seen in Europe that many companies are going downstream to the consumer. At the same point in time, you see that even in Germany, 3 companies in a very short period of time have indicated that the raw material intensive products need to be reconsidered. And here companies like Bayer have divested the polycarbonate polyurethane business or have brought it to the public market. Covestron, IPO, so it's separated from the portfolio of Bayer. Evonik is also separating its C4 and acrylic business, and most likely will one day backward integrate as well with a raw material supplier. And as we have done with rubber, so you see that companies change their portfolio setup, and the remaining parts are all differentiated, specialized products that do not need the backward integration. And I think this is what the European companies are striving for.
Okay, I'd like to just touch on the point of also environmental standards, which I think is applicable obviously across the industry and upstream, downstream, etc. Those are continuously coming into effect. We just saw a new, I think, shipping environmental standard being implemented. It's come in sooner. I think it's going to come out in 2020 in terms of how much sulfur ships can emit. That's been brought forward. In terms of the petchem industry, obviously you're under certain standard specs as well. And Mr. Florin, you mentioned that as well in terms of methanol being a good alternative for that. But how much of a challenge are any new environmental standards that are being put on the chemicals business producing? I'll start with you, Mr. Florin, please, in terms of if that's a cost issue, is it a challenge cost-wise to make those changes to production processes?
Well, I think we're going to continue to see new environmental regulations around the world. I think this is a fact of the future, and as these environmental regulations come in, the world is going to have to adapt to meet them. And one of the benefits of something like methanol as an energy source, when those standards are for emissions, methanol happens to be a really clean burning, high octane fuel which has very low emissions. So I think we can demonstrate that methanol is very, very competitive with other potential substitutes for things like heavy fuel oil. I think the challenge for the industry is to make sure the standards are in place, things are well tested, the safety and handling is in place, and you go step by step, that you don't put the cart before the horse and make sure everything's in place. And then you need a supply reaction to make sure there's enough methanol so that we don't repeat what happened in California in the 80s, where there was a full-blown methanol fuel blending program in place, and because there wasn't enough methanol to satisfy that program, it went away. So I think we need to be very careful going forward.
Okay, we have a question here that relates to what we've just talked about, which is whether these new environmental rules and regulations will affect sales of end products in the Middle East. Mr. Zackert or Mr. Total, would you like to take that? In terms of whether the any new environmental policies that come in will affect directly sales into the Middle East?
Well, I'm not so much aware about the details of the the regulations in this area, but first of all, I would like to say that the chemical industry, and I think also in this area, has committed itself to the so-called responsible care program, which means that every company is striving to get better and better every day in terms of environmental impact.
What about the difference in environmental regulations across Europe or between different regions, Mr. Zackert? Is that a sort of challenge for companies like yours in terms of meeting different types of regulations, or are we seeing a global standard come into place more and more on that front?
Well, it would be splendid if we would have a global standard. Unfortunately, this is not the case. So our assumption is that this will be more standard region by region, and in the second step, potentially then the respective governments realize that then after regional standards have been put in place, a global standard will be reached. But I can only reinforce what Mr. Staudigl has just said. We have to every day re-challenge the current production setup and strive for energy efficiency. So what we are currently doing in our company is to clearly, regardless what the European Commission is doing, we are preparing for optimizing our energy efficiency on a yearly basis and prioritize all energy efficient projects in our resource allocations respectively, because we are clearly of the opinion that tougher regulations will come, sometimes on a nation by nation basis, and therefore the earlier you're prepared, the better it is.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to go to one or two more questions that we've got coming in here quite quick and fast. Here we go. One for Mr. Zackert. What in your view, are the challenges that the GCC, things keep moving, the GCC market is facing in terms of rubber industry, and is our Lenseo going to address these challenges?
Well, I think here in the region, we have, especially in the kingdom, the clear desire, of course, to go downstream. And SABIC, as one big company next to Aramco, has already opened up here in the kingdom a plant in rubber. And I think the importance is that, of course, the real backward integration will be happening. And second, that then the products are marketed respectively globally. And here for me, it's not so much a question mark behind GCC or Middle East. For me, it's more how the competitive position the Middle East has is used in going global and basically penetrating the markets. The kingdom, the Middle East have such a great knowledge and competence on oil and gas, and of course the same marketing skills and competence now needs to be applied to go global with everything being produced here in the Middle East.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about that this morning in terms of the Middle Eastern producers needing to integrate more, needing to find common synergies and combine and sort of, I suppose, get rid of any overlap so that they can compete more globally as well. We have a question. Do you think there is a future for silicon production in the GCC? I suppose that's for you, Mr. Stodl.
I know that there are all kinds of thoughts and plans. In my opinion, it does not make sense. It does not make sense because there is already so much capacity in the world for siloxanes and absolutely sufficient capacity for downstream silicones. Every additional producer would most likely waste the money to establish more capacity.
Okay, thank you. Are we likely to see any Methanex investment in the GCC, given our competitive feedstock position? I suppose we need to go to you for that, Mr.
Yeah,
Brown.
we're a global company. We have 6 sites around the world. We're open to invest just anywhere in the world. I think for us in this region, it would be finding the appropriate partner. It would be unlikely we'd invest on our own in this region, but we're open to investing anywhere where we can get competitive feedstock and have a great talent force like we have here in the GCC. So we would be very open.
What would you say, I'll put this question to all three of you, in terms of capital investment into R&D and innovation, which is obviously a continuous process. But in these cycles that the industry in generally goes through, that sometimes tends to be put on the back burner. Do you feel that R&D and innovation into more specialized products and into specialized applications, as one of you was saying, not necessarily new products, but how can we apply what we have already, is that still being given enough priority under these?
Yeah, well, for us, methanol is methanol. There's not a lot of innovation that can be done on methanol, but as I tried to illustrate in my presentation, applications, innovation, where there are opportunities, economic or driven by environmental regulations, is where we spend all of our R&D. We call it business and product development as opposed to R&D, but we spend a tremendous amount of time, effort, and money and people in making sure that the applications have the appropriate technical standards, the health and safety, the handling. All of those things are there before we launch methanol into new product applications. So it's very important for us. And in a down market or an up market, I think you've got to be investing today for the future. If you stop investing in new applications, new demand, or new innovations, you'll hit a brick wall. And so I think it's very important in all parts of the cycle to invest.
Okay, in terms of methanol being an alternative or complement to other fuels, we have a question here: will methanol replace LNG in the energy and fuel space? Yes and no, and why? How much of a competitor is it to? I mean, LNG in this part of the world, obviously.
Yeah, I don't view the world like that. I view the world at all of the above. I think markets are markets and competition's competition, and it doesn't have to be an either or. I think there's different ways to solve the same problem. And different companies in different regions and different parts of the world will choose different things to meet the standards or the efficiencies or the economics that they're looking for. So I don't see this as an either or. I see growing the pie, making the pie bigger, and at the end of the day, it's all energy, whether it's gas to methanol or coal to methanol or LNG or oil, it's all energy.